In Vietnam, demonstrators are still out every Sunday to protest what they call Chinese aggression in the South China Sea. As we've seen in previous weeks, China and Vietnam are disputing each other's claims in this region, leading to confrontations between Vietnamese boats and Chinese patrol vessels. The weekly demonstrations in Vietnam are being encouraged by bloggers, and as our contributor in Hanoi, Nguyen Qui Duc, can tell you, they're being heard loud and clear.
The protests used to happen around the Chinese embassy, but then the police blocked off the streets around it. So the protesters suddenly moved down to Hong Kim Lake. It's normally a pleasant area, and I like to sit on my balcony and watch people stroll by or relax. But what's been happening in the past few weeks is that the Sunday morning atmosphere has really changed a lot. Yet again, the anti-Chinese slogans, the banners, the raised fists. People gathered by the hundreds, trying to get the attention of people driving by. That's when the authorities banned the protests, saying they interfered with traffic and created social disorder. The protesters persisted this past Sunday, but within minutes, plainclothes cops swooped in. The buses were waiting and ready. Over 50 people were arrested. On the buses, the anti-Chinese activists were now calling out, "Down with those arresting patriotic citizens." And some protesters on the streets suddenly rushed to get on the bus to volunteer to get arrested with the others. On blogs, the anti-Chinese sentiments were immediately changed and replaced with complaints about the authorities. The Hanoi People's Committee, wrote blogger Hang Mong, issued a ban on spontaneous anti-China protests, but no one signed the order. Not one of the four national leaders dare express support or disapproval, leaving it to the tabloids to make the announcements about this ridiculous ban. Indeed, official newspapers such as this one, Hanoi Mới, published by the People's Communist Committee, ran big headlines saying, "Being patriotic means strictly obeying the law." An editorial called on people to clearly recognize dangerous plots. That's a reference to a government warning about reactionary foreign elements, working with some protesters to mount an anti-government campaign. Bloggers also revealed that just a day or two before the arrests, some of them, along with journalists and writers, and a retired general and former ambassador to China, had been repeatedly visited in their homes by the police and local authorities. They were questioned about their participation and warned against it. Some were actually blocked from leaving their own home. Noted blogger and activist Nguyen Qui Duc, who was accused of inciting anti-government protests, quoted the 96-year-old retired general Nguyen Qui Duc as saying, "Many professors and intellectuals took part in the protests, so to say the bad element had taken advantage of the protesters is simply low and wrong." Government has also claimed that protesters, in fact, were damaging diplomatic efforts right now between Beijing and Hanoi. And there are fears and accusations for a while that the authorities have secretly ceded land to China. Here's an entry on a blog called Citizen Journalists. "Those who ordered their pawns to visit people's homes aren't stupid. They're in fact quite clever. They know exactly who sold the nation off and who the patriotic people are. But they've become so rich selling land belonging to the nation and the ancestors, all they want to do now is to keep the people stupid and weak." Strong words directed at the authorities and a clear risk of getting into further trouble. But from the former general and ambassador also came this warning. The more you suppress the people, the more you increase and help spread the anger. Then at one point, you'll no longer be able to control it. I'm Nguyen Qui Duc in Hanoi for LinkAsia.
Duc, in your piece, you talked about bloggers and demonstrators complaining about other territorial issues with China. What are some of those issues?
The protests have mainly been about the Spratly and Paracel Islands in the South China Sea. Throughout the 20th century, there have been competing claims of ownership, not only involving Vietnam and China, but also Taiwan, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Borneo. And it goes back to a 1958 communique issued by the then Prime Minister of Vietnam, Mr. Phạm Văn Đồng, who then claims that Vietnam accepted Chinese territorial claims, including area surrounding the islands. Lately, the sea lanes have had incidents in which Chinese ships have arrested Vietnamese fishing boats. There have been accusations also of cutting internet cables under the water. So the issue is very big, but the sovereignty issue here also includes the northernmost parts of Vietnam by the border with China. And that's where land disputes have been happening. Demarcation lines or borders have been in dispute, partly because of the war that the fierce and short but fierce battles that the Chinese and the Vietnamese fought there in 1979. The problem is that all the negotiations thus far have been done secretly. So the people in Vietnam suspect that their leaders might have ceded too much to the Chinese.
Now, there's something particularly notable about these protesters, other than just their willingness to stand up and be counted. Can you tell our viewers what that is?
There is an interesting point. It has to do with a naval battle that happened in the Paracel Islands in the 1970s between China and what was then the soldiers of the Republic of South Vietnam. What's happening now is that the demonstrators are walking around with sheets of papers with the names of those South Vietnamese soldiers who have died during that battle. But remember, these South Vietnamese soldiers were actually the soldiers who also fought with North Vietnam during the Vietnam War. But the protesters are now saying, let's forget about the issue that's very difficult to deal with, which is the issue of reconciliation 40 years after the Vietnam War. But let's just simply recognize these soldiers who fought against the Chinese as our own heroes.
Thanks a lot, Duc. Nguyen Qui Duc monitors Vietnam's social media for LinkAsia.
Link TV is the only U.S. network dedicated to global and national news, uncompromising documentaries, and diverse cultural programs. Programs which connect you to the world. To learn more, visit linktv.org.